Techniques we discuss here are meant for licensed wildlife professionals. If you aren't licensed and trained for wildlife rehabilitation, do not attempt to capture, hold, or rehabilitate any wild animal. If you find an injured wild animal, a wildlife professional can recommend next steps. Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation, Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buell. We'll tackle topics about rescue, care, management, reconditioning, and releasing wildlife found in North America. This is a deep dive into each subject. We hope to give rehabilitators information they can use because they're already going to great lengths to rescue and nurse animals back to health. An injured or orphaned wild animal's journey to restored health and independence in their natural habitat is delicate and complex. We draw techniques and expertise from many disciplines. Many animals brought into rehabilitation cannot be saved. The last gift we can give them is humane euthanasia. We will talk more about when this is necessary. Sometimes animals are deemed non-releasable and evaluated to be suitable for a life in captivity. When that happens, we shift to a long-term approach to managing their care, training, and housing. Some such animals serve as ambassador animals, a term for the animals that rehabilitators use to educate the public. Each episode will speak with experts who represent specialty topics across the profession of wildlife rehabilitation, ambassador animal care and management, showcasing best practices. Welcome back. This is the second half of my conversation with Sara Cole, a wildlife rehabilitator whose interest in rescuing animals dates back to early childhood. If you missed the first part of our conversation, check out episode 1. I was fortunate enough to catch up with Sara before the prime rescue season for the eastern cottontail rabbit began in northern Minnesota. Eastern cottontail rabbits are some of Sara's favorite animals to work with. And we're recording this in February, but the season really isn't that far away.
No, it's right around the corner.
So how do you ensure that, you have best practices in place for your cottontail rabbits that you'll be raising, and how do you make sure going on that you can continue to make sure that you've got best practice? And what are best practices?
I find that a really intriguing question, right? And it's one that probably, I still think of the field of wildlife rehab as sort of a field full of cowboys, right? In the sense that it's kind of the Wild West of animal medicine. And even a lot of, I think there are now vets being trained in that, but not that many, and I think still most veterinary medicine is our domestic, animals. So it's intriguing, sometimes in a positive way and sometimes in a way that makes me lose sleep, that in many cases, there isn't a one right answer, right? And this about cottontails. At the last, NWRA symposium, there was an after hours on cottontails, and there were probably 50 people sitting around, all there to share ideas, talk about best practice. And I don't know that one of them had the same protocol. It was just, and everybody really felt like they were using the best protocol, but there were different formula mixes, there were different caging ideas, there were, you name it, different feeding scheduling, there's some accepted practices, but I think so much of it is still, what folks have tried, what has worked for them. For me, I love learning. And so I love reading, I want to read every paper I can get my hands on. I want to talk to every person I can talk to who's had success. And I think how do I keep learning and really just seeing what evolves? I think continuing to try to learn from other folks, and even things like formula mixes, what's the best mix? There are folks out there who are using this mix versus this mix, or folks who are using raw goat milk versus not, versus, there's so much of it, I think, there's probably a lot of right answers. And I'm really intrigued by knowing what the most right answer is. So I'm going to keep reading and talking to people and remembering that I'm learning a lot every year. So it's a small thing, but one of my learnings last year was, again, Peggy Pop, who's just a wonderful, really brilliant, generous woman, had a lot of success with these stuffed animals that you can put a heartbeat in. I think their brand name is Snuggle Puppies, so we call them Snuggle Puppies. And they're about the size of kind of a normal stuffed animal dog, but you can get smaller ones. And then you put this little heartbeat in that's battery operated, and it just kind of has a heartbeat. I think some folks use them with domestic puppies and kittens to kind of de-stress them, if they're newly in the family or away from their mothers. And I really started to wonder whether they would be effective with rabbits. Should we be using them? And nobody really knew. We weren't doing it at Wildwoods. Peggy said she wasn't sure. And so last summer I started to do it just to see. I thought, well, I'll watch and learn. I'll see whether this is comforting or might it even be distressing. I don't know. I mean, I'll see what happens. So I tested it out and I saw pretty quickly that the rabbits would actually position themselves deliberately on top of the snuggle puppy. And so they obviously really liked it. They would go under it, they would go on top of it, but they really liked having it. I would notice especially that with orphans or singletons, it would help, them feel much more comforted. So that became something that I started doing all the time. But at the beginning, at this point last year, I didn't know that. So it's a small thing, but I feel like, I'm hoping to just keep learning all the time about, what works and what might feel comforting.
The other thing I was thinking about is that you mentioned early on that you are going to be doing an electronic database system. And so if some of this data gets put into the database system, plus, the types of formula you're using and things like that you could actually then look at your own data and compare it against itself and be able to see for your facility what is working better than not.
Yes.
And because at least in most places in Minnesota, a cottontail is a cottontail, and cottontails are cottontails, but if they're in different habitats or different things, their natural history might be slightly different. And what is also really interesting to me, but a really tough nut to crack, is that you were talking about formula earlier, and the formula that baby bunnies that mom feeds at the beginning is different than the formula or the milk that she has and is giving us at the end. And the first batch of bunnies she has in the spring is a very different kind of composition and with fats and things like that, depending on what she's eating, versus the second or third batch she has later in the summer. That to me is a pretty tough nut to crack, to be able to figure out that precise. And maybe 20 or 30 years from now, we'll be able to do that with information that you're gathering right now, or we'll be gathering once you have your permit and are starting to.
Yeah, to me, that's the kind of stuff it just, that keeps me up at night in a good way. I think just thinking, as you mentioned, it's so complex, not only, this season or just the timing of those litters, what is the difference between litter one and the last litter of the season? That's just it's such a smart question. And it points to the fact that you can just get, the amount that we know probably pales in comparison to the amount that we're still all learning, which is just really intriguing to me, and it's the kind of thing that day by day really just keeps me wanting to learn and ask questions. And, anybody who tells me they have any experience, I'm bound to ask them 1,000 questions.
So here's a question, and we'll get back to like permits and the rest of the process here, but I'm really interested in this is, yes, we need people to focus on cottontail rabbits because a lot of cottontails come into centers as orphans, or maybe not orphans, but they get orphaned. And I'm sure you've thought about this, but why rehabilitate cottontail rabbits? 80% of them die, before their first birthday. They're prey animals. They could eat.
Yeah.
So for you, I'm not talking about answering for anybody else, but for you, why cottontail rabbits?
It sort of makes me think of that old parable, right, about the starfish, that there's a person walking on the beach and they're like picking up starfish and throwing them back into the ocean, and so they can survive ostensibly in this parable. And someone else says, why bother? It's not going to make a difference, that there's all these starfish kind of out of the ocean. You can't possibly make a dent. And the person throwing them back says, well, it made a difference to this one. And so I think there's an element of that to me, that there's an element of that there is a responsibility I think we have to the world to be good citizens or to give back, or to be kind. And so I think there's an aspect of that it matters in the moment that act of sort of working with an animal, which to me, I'm not a religious person, but to me, there's something very holy. And it's just this kind of Zen-like practice, right, of sort of moving through the system. You've got this many to feed, and you're feeding, and you're watching, and you're quiet, and it's just the two of you, these two living beings, right? And you're doing this small thing, which is feeding and caring for, and that there's something in the act itself, whatever the outcome is, right? Because many of them die in care, right? I mean, many of them don't even, not only do they not live long when they get out, they don't make it, but that there's still something inherently good in that communing with that other living being, in a kind of wholehearted, caring way. And maybe the similarity to my day-to-day life is that, the issues that I sort of tackle along with my organization are things that we'll never solve, like hunger and homelessness and education inequity. I mean, I'll never live long enough to solve all of those things. But I think there's something important to me about the effort of trying to make things better, whether it's for one person or for one community. And so I think that for me is part of that, just that there is goodness in the act itself, and also that they're a part of the circle of life. So I think that even if they're out there and they don't last, very long, as they don't, because they're prey animals, that they become a part of a larger portrait of sort of what it is to be a part of the natural world, which is to kind of come and go. Not that I don't like to imagine them all living happy and healthy, but especially after the many hours, yes, after the many hours that you put in. But I think there's something really, there's something that is good. It's so funny. I think I try to be a good person, as I think we all probably do. But I think very few things feel as purely good to me working with animals does. It just feels very good, in kind of the purest sense that I get to experience it. So it's a gift. I think of that old kind of Buddhist, like, chop wood and carry water, this idea that our normal everyday life can be kind of a meditation, or could be holy, or could be to some greater good. And I think that feels very true to me when I'm doing that kind of work.
I think it's so lovely how you refer to it as like this portrait of life, that it's all part of that picture, that portrait. I think that's very, very lovely thought, a very nice way to think about it. So have you decided or thought about like capacity?
I have. Again, I was lucky enough last year to, at times, I'd be the only real caretaker for the infant cottontails at Wildwood. So I have a fairly, I think, okay, at least a baseline sense of sort of what I can handle, how long it takes to do X amount of feedings, and, what ages. So I have thought a lot about that, and had a few different moments last year, I think, of being at the upper end of capacity and sort of feeling what that feels like. So yeah, I've given some thought to, just how many can I have and at what stages? Because at that, in those early days and first couple of weeks, it's just so intensive, right? When you're doing the feedings, it's really just you. So, that's the time that stacks up, especially as they're learning to feed. Sometimes you have a new nest come in, and those first few feedings are, it's just weird for everybody, right? They're getting used to it, and you're kind of getting used to them, and it can take a lot longer. So, the folks that have moved on and they're eating in their cages, are less high maintenance. But yeah, so I have thought a lot about that, and just kind of what does it take, and what's the most I can give, and sort of, be doing it well, and not hitting my danger zone in terms of just being exhausted.
Oh, yes, that is definitely a danger, especially because the season can be so intense. And cottontail rabbits are really intense for a short amount of time. But
Yes.
if you're constantly getting in batches, then that intensity can stretch out. So it's a very important thing to think about. So do you think you're going to be roping your husband into helping you with some of these feedings?
I feel like he's got to, in some sense, you can't not be roped in as a spouse, right? Like, you have to, like, respect the room, or you have to, I mean, he's certainly done many trips with me to pick up cages, or, clean cages, or, so I feel like he's always kind of peripherally roped in. I feel like I'd love for him to be more roped in, and kind of catch the bug. So we'll have to see whether he ever does. But I think he's always, my hobbies are to some extent always at least peripherally his hobbies. And we have to talk a lot about it. So he ends up at the very least talking a lot about wildlife and, hearing me perseverate about things. So I think that, he sort of can't help but be a little bit involved.
Right. We've talked a lot about, certainly lots of the different people who are involved in this endeavor of rehabilitation, right? We've got you as the rehabilitator. We have the regulatory folks at the state and federal level. If you were going to do birds, you'd be at the federal level too. And it's certainly also the public and the veterinarian, right? So that's kind of the group of people. It's not just you. It is a lot of other folks involved. So when it comes to the public, now you may be getting a lot of your cottontails, at least the first a few years, from an organization, Wildwoods, and trying to help them out a lot. But how do you feel the public interface with wildlife rehabilitation? How do you feel that should be? What should that look like for you?
I think it's a tremendous part of wildlife rehab. I don't know if it's the part that we always talk about the most, but I think that that interface is so crucial, right? Because it's about empathy and, teaching folks to sort of be good neighbors and good citizens of the world, which I think is this really fundamental thing for all of us. And some of us got to see that growing up, and some folks maybe didn't get to see that growing up. But I remember, Farzad was always really eloquent about talking about this and how he really saw the task of wildlife rehabilitators was not only the work they did with the animals, but sort of what they did for the public, both being a resource because it's a really horrific feeling to see something that's suffering or is harmed and to not know what to do and to not have anything to do. I've certainly had moments like that in my past with wildlife when I would see something that was injured and I just didn't know what to do or what resources there were. And I feel like that's just a horrific feeling. So I love the fact that the public has a resource to help because I feel like many, many people do want to help when they see something that's in trouble. And sometimes when they see something that's not in trouble, but they think it is, which is a whole different issue. But I think folks are generally trying to do good. And, Farzad would tell stories about children who would call Wildwood. Sometimes they'd found something that was injured and maybe the parent wouldn't want to bring them in or wasn't taking it seriously. And in one case, he got on the phone with the parent who was being resistant to kind of driving their child to Wildwoods. And he said to them, basically something to the effect of, the care that your child wants to take with this injured bird, you're going to need that someday. That kind of empathy and care, you're going to need that from your child. So be careful that you don't extinguish it, basically. And, what a powerful message. And that father did drive his daughter to Wildwoods. But I think there's something really powerful, right, with teaching folks that we owe something to each other. I think as living creatures, we owe something to each other. And I think that's care and dignity. And so I think if we can educate folks about sort of what to do when they find something that's injured, or even educate folks about sort of what's normal, as you well know, a lot of cottontails that we get will not be orphaned. They will be kidnapped inadvertently by someone who finds a nest and they think it's abandoned. And if we could even just give a little bit more information out there about how do you really know if a fawn is abandoned? How do you really know if a nest of rabbits is in trouble? I think even that kind of information is really powerful because I think folks are generally trying to do the right thing. So if we can equip them with some basic knowledge, it's great. And then I think if we can reward kindness and empathy, we certainly can never have enough of that. So I think that that's a huge part of the job of rehabbers that isn't really maybe about hands-on care of animals, but I think is such a fundamental part of what folks are doing.
I totally agree with empathy and trying to get the good information out there because we certainly know that there's a lot of information out there that is not in the best interest of the animal or is kind of incorrect information. So along that lines, so you would have, when you start getting any cottontail rabbits in directly from the public, you would have that direct interface with that person or family, either through the phone call or face to face. But are you thought about doing anything other than that, or in addition to that, like social media, which of course is a big presence in all of our lives, going on TV or radio or a podcast,
I
or
know. There's so many choices.
or written work, like submissions to the local papers, for example. I mean, have you, and it is probably maybe too early in your process of rehabilitation to think about this, but is that something you either thought about or thought, oh, I'd be really excited to do X or Y?
Yeah, no, I think those are all good questions. And I think there's so much, hopefully just more and more ways for us to share good information as time goes on. And I always laugh and say I'm very Gen X. So I still feel like I'm only ever semi-literate with, as much as I use Facebook and Instagram. I feel like I'll never be quite as adept as some millennials I know, but I think that's a great way to share information. And I now follow a bunch of rehabbers on Facebook, and it's great to just see see the things they're dealing with, see some of the things they're posting about. To your point about even finding supplies, there's a whole Facebook page that's just dedicated to sort of discounts that rehabbers might want to know about, which tells you how far we've come, I guess, right? That there's a specialty Facebook page just for that. But I have thought about that, and also thought about, how can I use the platform that I have? So I also sit on Wildwood's board now, and we've been talking a lot about education and how can we educate, especially children. And one thing the YMCA has is 1,000 kids every day after school. So, sometimes it's just a matter of, working together to say, let's develop a curriculum that we could put in all of our after school programs. We can do that really easily. So sometimes I think too, how do I leverage my sort of day-to-day life to get that information out, especially I think to kids who are often really hungry to hear about it, and then they go home and kind of boss their parents around in a good way and talk to them and tell them what to do, and teach them things. So yeah, I think there's a responsibility to get the word out in as many ways as possible. So I definitely will be thinking about what the most effective ways to do that are.
So bringing back kind of pretty early experience you had with the deer that had been hit by a car that needed to have field euthanasia, and all those questions and things that brought up in you and eventually led you down this path. Both of us know, and you mentioned earlier, that at least a portion of the cottontail rabbits that you're going to get are either going to die or have to be euthanized, either because of an injury or because they are just not doing very well, or for a multitude of reasons. So, two-part question. So you are interfacing with a family that, they've connected with this baby bunny and they're giving it to you and you're taking care of it, and you've maybe said or maybe not said that you're going to get back to them and tell them what happens, or maybe they call you, how is the bunny that we named, is Fluffy, how is that bunny doing? And unfortunately that animal had to be euthanized. So that's the first part of my question, is how do you communicate that, or do you communicate that? And then the other part is, how do you deal with, we talked a little bit about that earlier, but it's certainly part of the circle of life, but when you are a rehabilitator and you are trying to get these animals back into the wild, but you're unable to do that, how, and that can weigh on a person, especially if it happens frequently, even if it's no fault of your own as a rehabilitator. We know that even rehabilitation facilities that do really, really good job don't have a really high release rate, because some of these animals that especially come in injured, you won't be getting injured, but animals that are coming injured, sometimes they just come in too broken and we can't help them. So two-part question. So what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the second part. Again, I'm grateful to have had so much hands-on experience at Wildwoods, and I have had the opportunity and sort of necessity to do a fair amount of euthanizations. Mostly, again, with the infant cottontails, it's just that they're not thriving. They can they're fragile. They don't do great, as you know, in rehab, and they can quickly go downhill, with kind of gastrointestinal stuff. And I mean, it all sounds great, right? It's very easy to say things like circle of life, and going into it, and then I think, it just is a matter of having that good support system. I had a few days last summer, particularly, that were just really hard. I had a tiny nest that I thought was doing great. And so I had been working with them for weeks. I mean, they would just climb right onto my hand. I had known them for a long, long time. And then I thought it was particularly hard because I thought they were sort of past the point of trouble. And then sort of one by one, I lost them. And I remember just kind of sitting at my kitchen table and kind of crying and saying to my husband, why am I doing this? This is just, this just feels, why am I doing this? This just feels horrible. And he would sort of gently remind me about all the rabbits that we had released, and I keep a little chart, a little check mark chart, so that I can kind of glance at it and think, okay, we're doing good work. But I don't know what the magic is there. I believe very strongly in good death. I think there are some deaths are better than others, and that there is such a thing as a good death. Mm-hmm. And I hope for it for myself and for everybody I know and love. We're not very good at dealing with that with humans, but I think we can give it to animals, and I think it can have dignity and painlessness. We can do our best to give something a good death, and that matters. But I think it can still be very difficult, especially when you've communed with this little being for weeks and hours and hours and hours, to have to feel like you failed or that there was something that you couldn't control. So, I don't know. I don't think I have any secret to that, other than I got to do it a fair amount. And I'm sure I'll probably have some hard days this coming season as well. And hopefully will just do my best to remind myself of the good that's happening, because that's a tough one. And yet I think there's a responsibility that we owe to things that we take care of, to give them timely, to euthanize in a timely way if we know that that's what has to be done. And like early on, again, a lot of what I know came from Farzad, and I asked him a question about that, because I think when you first start doing the work, it feels like that's the, how do you know? And what, there's so many questions about that. And he said something about, he said that he felt the worst when he would find an animal that had died in its cage, because he would often feel like he should have seen the signs and he should have stepped in sooner. Now, that's not always possible, but what I took away from that was that he felt like it was his responsibility to really be that sort of, euthanization was a part of rehab, right? And that was part of his job to tell the truth to himself when he saw that things were beyond repair. And that can be a really hard thing to do because it can feel like there's a lot of gray there, or that you're telling yourself it'll get better, even when historically it hasn't, or it might not.
I think that it can be very difficult to be honest with yourself.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you're by yourself as a rehabilitator, it can really be hard because you don't have any other people to bounce things off of and help bring you back to say, well, do you remember those rabbits last year? Or let's look at the data, or those kinds of things. But two things struck me as you were talking about this. One of them was compassion fatigue. And you talked about that briefly, about trying to make sure that, to point to the amount of good that you've done, or the amount of rabbits you've released in this case, those kinds of things. And compassion fatigue is a real thing. And when you're in a profession, which wildlife rehabilitation is, whether you get paid or not, it's a profession. But compassion fatigue can really be wearing if you aren't inoculated, maybe that's the word, and having those things that can show you the good that you're doing in the world and how important you are in the world within rehabilitation and on the outside of rehabilitation as well. So I think that's an important piece of what you're talking about. The other thing to know, whether or not I'm not sure our listeners know or not, but you mentioned the words good death. The word euthanasia is from the Greek, and it means good death.
Oh, I forgot that. Yes, yes, yes. Well, that's exactly true, right? I mean, I think it is such a, I think it strikes me that we're just, as Americans, I can only speak to Americans because I haven't lived in any other culture, but we're just not comfortable talking about death, with each other, about ourselves,
Yeah.
so I think in this world, it can feel like we're learning about those things because I don't think we're accustomed to thinking or talking about that in other ways.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. So then back to my first part of that whole
Yeah,
question.
yeah. You
So
tell
you
people.
get in a rabbit and you've got a family who are so hopeful that it makes it and it doesn't. So how do you talk about that to people who are not in the business, so to speak?
I think to really, thank the family and let them know that they did the right thing by bringing the animal to you, and also saying, and there's no easy way to say this, I don't think, but just saying that, sometimes the outcome is not that the animal goes back into the wild. Sometimes the outcome is that they have a death with dignity and with comfort, and that is in and of itself a really big gift, and that can be a gift that we give to things that we might find who are in trouble or injured or orphaned, and that hopefully there's some solace in that outcome as well, even if it's not the most hoped for outcome, that there's something really good in that, and that they've done good, and sort of emphasizing that is good.
Mhm.
I hope.
And I think that thought behind it, and what you said was, is that it can be a gift we can give. Yes, it's a final gift, but we can relieve that suffering, and it is a gift.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really also really like that. So your journey so far, at one point in the conversation, you said, so far it's been pretty smooth. If you were giving advice to someone in Minnesota or anywhere, at least in the US, was interested in becoming a rehabilitator, is there advice that you would give?
Yeah, maybe. And I know, things differ state to state, but I think just learning as much as you can. That sounds really obvious, but I think there's so many great resources out there, whether it's the state itself and, study guides, or the state prep for the state exam, but just not to be afraid either to just reach out to people. It has been, I've reached out to a number of rehabbers that I only met briefly or had never met at all, and folks have been so gracious that I think just reaching out and asking questions, or even saying, hey, can I come see your shop? Can I come visit your rehab center? Can I come visit your house? Can I see what you do? Folks are so gracious, I think, about that kind of thing, and that kind of learning, and the web of support that gets created when you make those connections, to me, is really invaluable as you go through the process and figure out where you might want to fit within it. So I think, learn as much as you can, read as much as you can, but reach out as much as you can. Talk to folks who've been through the process, other rehabbers, um, because I think everyone's been so generous, and there's so much to be learned from just speaking to other people. So I think that's a great stone to turn over. And I think if we're willing to be vulnerable enough to sort of ask for help or ask for information, it's always really gratifying to see people come forward and be super generous with sharing
Mhm.
everything they know, their own experiences, and then those become, I think, the people you can reach out to, as you go through your own journey and you have a question about X, Y, or Z. Those are the folks who will answer your texts at 5 a.m. in the morning, 10 p.m. at night, and just really share what they've learned. And to me, that's really comforting as well. So I feel like I have this whole new network of friends now, and trusted sort of comrades, which is also really nice.
It is nice that they understand too, right?
Yes,
Kind of a
yes,
weird profession we've chosen, a second
yes,
career. And yeah, having somebody who truly understands, you don't have to explain it. You just
right,
have to just say, oh my gosh, I can't get this animal to poop, or I'm going
yes,
diarrhea.
yes.
And they're like, okay, we get it. We totally.
Yes, it is. It's so comforting. Or just, you want to celebrate something, or you're feeling bad. You're having one of those days, and you're just feeling like, oh, this is a hard one. To reach out to somebody who can say that they've been there, is really awesome. And so I think and they're just cool people. I feel like rehabbers are just weird, cool people. And I say that I like to think of myself as a weird, cool person at my best. So, I mean, I think these other folks who have all these different kind of areas of expertise and then just to learn what sparks everybody, right? Like this person loves turkey vultures and this person loves weasels and this person, it's such a cool thing when you hit that thing that's the spark for folks and they just kind of come alive.
Yeah, it is wonderful. I totally agree.
I heard something really beautiful and I hope it's true. It's kind of stuck with me. Someone told me that they had heard, and I don't know if it comes from a certain culture or faith-based, ideology, but they had said that they heard that when we die, we're not going to be judged by some all-knowing being, but we're going to be judged by the animals that we've interacted with. And I just thought that was such a really beautiful thing. I think I love, sometimes when I fall asleep at night, I think about the animals that I'm working with at Wildwoods and then this year at my own house. And I think about all their little heartbeats kind of just beating. And it's this sort of comforting thing. Again, I release rabbits in a variety of ways. And now every rabbit I see in any place I release, I just assume is, one that I released, whether it is or not. But I kind of love this idea of, to me, that's such a beautiful concept that we would be judged in that way, because I think working with animals kind of strips us down to our essential natures, and I think we can really be best selves in some of those moments. And it's just really beautiful. So it has brought me just tremendous joy. And I feel like it has quickly, taken over my life in a really good way. And everyone who knows me is sort of roped into a conversation now about wildlife rehab, whether they want to be or not. And it's just such a great thing. So I just feel it's really a joyful place for me. And I feel lucky to have been on the journey so far. And I'm looking forward to just learning so much more. I feel like I know only the smallest amount, and just looking forward to continuing to learn and grow and sort of be worthy of this pursuit, because I think it is something that we should all live up to, and it is really awesome. So I think for anyone listening who's even thinking about it or thinking about getting more involved, I would say do it. I think there's just a tremendous amount of joy that can be found in being kind of part of the natural world in this way. So in whatever way folks want to come to it, I think that I would encourage them to just keep pushing forward if they feel passionate about it, because it's really sort of a magical place to be. And there's a lot of really kind of cool, wonderful, strange, brilliant people out there who are all interested in it as well.
Awesome. Well, I think that is a beautiful way to finish our conversation today. Sara, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and to talk to our listeners about how this journey is going for you in wildlife rehabilitation. And we may have to check back in a year.
For sure. Yeah, I hope. Right. Let's see what I learned this summer.
That's right.
That's for sure. No, I appreciate the opportunity. It makes me, I feel a lot of joy just talking about it, and it's been wonderful to work with you so far, and I'm looking forward to learning and growing and just serving the natural world in a better way. So thanks for the conversation. It was really fun.
This was another episode of Wildlife Rehabilitation Rescue to Release. We're glad you joined us today. As many of you know, rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus, or RHDV, is currently moving through North America's domestic and wild rabbits. Future episodes will focus on biosecurity and specifically on RHDV. Wildlife Rehabilitation Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buell. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, visit raptor.umn.edu. Our producer is Kirk Clucky. Special thanks to our guests Sara Cole, Partners for Wildlife, and the Raptor Center at the University of Minnesota. Are you interested in becoming a licensed wildlife rehabilitator? Visit the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association website at nwrawildlife.org for resources to get started. And remember, if you do find an injured or orphaned animal, please contact a licensed wildlife rehabilitator in your area. And that's our show. Hope you'll join us next time.